If you're even casually familiar with film or television, you're familiar with the phrase saved in the edit. Editing is something of an invisible art form, and it's rarely given the attention or credit that it deserves. This is perhaps because it comes towards the end of the creative process and relies on existing material. In order to edit a film, a writer has to have written a script, the actors have to perform their scenes, and the director has to have shot it all. However, the edit of a film or television episode is transformative. Television director Darren Morgan has described the edit as the final rewrite. Editing is an art form. It's also, when used well, a scalpel and not a chainsaw. In the edit, directors can delete entire characters or subplots that were considered vital to the production. Terrence Malick has famously cut down actors who thought they were the leads of his movies into extras with a handful of lines.
I was in that film. I was cut out too. I was happy.
It's possible to alter the mood and tone of a film by altering the rhythms of individual scenes or sequences, by juxtaposing images, or even by cutting a single line that shifts the entire meaning of a scene or motivation of a character. Hollywood history is full of films that were saved in the edit. Famously, editor Marcia Lucas deserves a lot of the credit for salvaging Star Wars. Men in Black was dramatically reworked just 2 weeks away from its original release. Its entire plot changed in the edit. When the footage of the shark model in Jaws looked unconvincing on screen, editor Verna Fields used what footage she had to create a film where the creature's absence was the most effective beat. However, because good storytelling involves setting things up to pay them off later, it's worth flagging that saving a movie in the edit doesn't always mean making it shorter. When Francis Ford Coppola turned in his cut of The Godfather, producer Robert Evans lamented that it was too short. "You shot a saga, but you turned in a trailer. Go back and make a picture." If you've been paying any attention to modern pop culture, you know that superhero movies are in a bit of an existential crisis at the moment. We're not going to argue about why that is, because that'd be a whole other video. What's important though is that it seems like the companies producing these movies have realized this and are making the clumsiest and most panicked attempts imaginable to deal with this. They're trying to solve it all in the edit. If you'll allow me to get on a soapbox for a moment, there's a particularly pernicious piece of modern cultural discourse that really grinds my gears. It's the argument that modern movies are too long. It often involves pointing to a specific bladder-busting behemoth like Oppenheimer or Killers of the Flower Moon or Avatar: The Way of Water, or even something populist like The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and complaining that movies are getting longer. This is not true. Movies are not getting longer. The data demonstrates that the average movie length has been consistent since the 1960s. There was a minor dip in the 1980s, perhaps due to the formal limitations of VHS, but that was the exception that proved the rule. Now, there is an argument to be made that higher grossing movies have generally gotten longer, but that's a trend dictated by audiences rather than studios. Studios are still making the same movies, but audiences are choosing to see the longer ones. It's also worth acknowledging that a movie's length has no relationship to its quality. Roger Ebert famously argued that no good movie is too long, and no bad movie is short enough. Both Duck Amok and The Godfather Part 2 are the perfect length.
Okay, have it your way.
I've somehow watched Oppenheimer 8 times in the year since it was released, and that combined viewing time still feels shorter than the 88 minutes that I spent watching Thunder Force. I think part of me is still watching Thunder Force.
Son of a bitch. God damn it!
It's worth stressing this because it gets at one of the big issues with how the studios have been editing to try to salvage their superhero slate. Most of these releases have been cut down dramatically. Just look at how short these movies are compared to the movies they are sequelizing. 2018's Aquaman ran 2 hours and 23 minutes, but its sequel was cut down to 1 hour 55. In 2019, the billion-dollar grossing Captain Marvel ran 2 hours and 4 minutes, but its sequel was cut down to 1 hour and 45 minutes, making it the shortest movie in the 15 years of the MCU.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
There are reasons to do this, but they have nothing to do with making the movie better. The goal is to increase the number of theatrical showtimes over its opening weekend, and therefore goose the movie's box office over that opening weekend. And in both cases, it didn't work. The Marvels went on to have the lowest opening weekend in the MCU, while Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom had one of the lowest starts in the history of the DCEU, and that's a pretty competitive race. In contrast, the two highest grossing superhero movies of the year, Guardians Volume 3 and Across the Spider-Verse, both ran over 2 hours and 20 minutes. This editing philosophy is also evident in the superhero streaming options. Echo, Marvel's most recent streaming show, was initially rumored as 8 episodes and then announced as 6, and then finally released as 5. It was also released simultaneously, the only live-action Marvel show not to get the classic weekly release model. Although Netflix pioneered that binge model with House of Cards, recent years have seen streaming services like Disney, Amazon, Apple, and others spread their high-profile releases weekly in order to retain viewers and grow their audience. Even Netflix now splits seasons of shows like You and Stranger Things in order to retain viewership across financial quarters. Every live-action Marvel and Star Wars show has had a weekly release, but Echo was just dumped in one go, reflecting the studio's lack of faith in it.
We thought it'd be really cool and unexpected.
Yeah, fun and kind of a twist.
As with the decision to cut down the Marvels, there are reasons to do this, but they have nothing to do with quality. Releasing all the episodes at once gives the show a chance of hitting the streaming charts, which are based on the total number of minutes watched. Disney also moved Echo out of its original Thanksgiving slot to a less competitive January release because it's easier for a show like this to stand out during the dump months. The shorter season makes it more likely that those binging will actually reach the finish line, thus gaming the completion rate, an important streaming metric that would allow the company to frame the show as a success. To be clear, these are not good reasons to heavily retool a project in post-production, and they do not result in better films and shows. There's a real let's get this over with energy to both projects, where the priority isn't to make them better, but instead to make them quicker. Watching both The Marvels and Echo, it's possible to get a sense of a more interesting project buried beneath these cynical decisions. While the best film and television editing reveals more of the story being told, these efforts bury the heart of the narrative. The Marvels is a story about the consequences of disastrous foreign intervention, the aftermath of Carol Danvers' war against the Kree Supreme Intelligence. After the events of the first film, Carol went to Hala, toppled the government, and made enemies with the movie's primary antagonist, Dar-Ben.
How goes it out there?
Thriving.
Carol is ashamed of this and has chosen to go into exile away from Earth. However, perhaps because the movie's afraid of being seen as too dark or too serious, this vitally important piece of backstory is buried in a voiceover-laden flashback an hour into the runtime. As a result, the audience spends the first half of the movie with no idea who Dar-Ben is and why Carol, the nominal protagonist of the film, is being such a buzzkill.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Carol's attack on Hala should have been the movie's 5-minute cold opening, and The Marvels is fundamentally broken by the fact that it's not. This approach also breaks the movie on a smaller scene-by-scene basis. There are 2 sequences in The Marvels where the heroes leave entire worlds and presumably millions of people to die. These should be big dramatic moments. There's a shot of our heroes looking a little sad, then there's a wide shot, and then there's a cutaway with no sense of the scale, scope, or drama that a superhero movie should have. The movie seems oddly small for a film where millions of people have just died. These themes are admittedly pretty heavy for a superhero film, but they're also so fundamental that they can't be entirely cut out, and the movie would require a more fundamental rework to completely remove them. So the compromise is to just bury them in the movie and get them over with as quickly as possible, and the results are tonally jarring. Similarly, it's obvious that Echo has been thrown into a blender. Just take a look at the show's writing credits, which suggest that significant bits and pieces have been chopped and changed. Echo was supposed to be the first Marvel Spotlight series, a continuity-light, accessible show that casual fans could enjoy. However, because the show insists on laying out the character's life largely chronologically, it takes the first episode about half an hour to catch up with where Maya Lopez was at the end of Hawkeye. It would make more sense to interspace a lot of these flashback scenes with other episodes, to provide context for specific relationships or events. Indeed, it seems likely that the Daredevil cameo from the premiere was originally intended to slot into the start of what is now the 4th episode of the show, but the studio just couldn't wait. After all, that's one reason why the first episode of She-Hulk was heavily retooled from what was supposed to be the 8th, allowing the premiere to feature Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner. The opening episode of Echo even recycles footage of Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye.
But I got 7th place in my fantasy league.
The edit here prioritizes the fans being serviced over the story being told. It's obvious that Echo was supposed to spend more time in Tamaha, and that Maya's childhood best friend Bonnie was meant to be a more central character. There's an interesting show buried somewhere in Echo, one that uses an indigenous character to craft a subversive revisionist superhero western about a drifter just passing through town, robbing trains, and being hunted by sinister outsiders, reframing the pulp history of American pop culture from the cowboy to the outlaw to the superhero from a Native American perspective. You can see that in the cold opens, which evoke Thanksgiving football and Western cereals, but with indigenous protagonists. However, the edit has no faith in that story or those themes, simply so we can get to Kingpin a little bit quicker. These choices are all defensively and cynically made in the hopes of stopping the bleeding and concealing the wounds that have been done to the brand. However, they betray a complete lack of faith in the creatives telling these stories and in the material itself. There's no attempt to make these projects better, just to milk what little shareholder value they can from them.
You motherfucker!
Watching The Marvels and Echo, it always feels like the studio is promising viewers that at least this'll all be over soon. It's the unkindest cut of all. I've been Darren Mooney and this was The Backdrop.